While it's easy to see Stevonnie as such a staple of Steven Universe, for the first chunk of the series, it was actually pretty rare to see Steven and Connie fuse, with the character only having 4 speaking roles in the first 4 seasons. In fact, immediately after the character's debut in Alone Together, there is a 50+ episode gap where the fusion is only in the show for a few seconds in We Need to Talk. But when the character does finally get another major appearance in Beach City Drift, we not only get another great quarter hour, but also one that fully dives into the consequences of Alone Together in such a way that even rivals that legendarily great episode, and that's what we're talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through beloved character Kevin's long-awaited second appearance, and talk about how, in between some really fun action sequences, the episode uses fantastic writing and imagery to explore the aftermath of Stevonnie's experience at the end of their debut.
And I told them, the universe is my road.
Besides Steven magically changing heights in every single shot, the first scene of this episode before its antagonist shows up is just this really cute scene with Greg, Connie, and Steven as they establish that his father has bought a car, a 96 Hyundai Supremo, which is such a fantastic car name that I'm very confident a good chunk of the audience thought it was real. Anyway, starting from the second that Kevin shows up, the episode reveals something that kind of divides fan reception of this episode, which is that everything in Beach City Drift is super over the top, even more so than a usual episode of the show. Some of this comes from the various pieces of racing media this one parodies, but also some of it seems to just intentionally match its antagonist's energy. While Kevin is inherently a character that's somewhat impossible for a story to take super seriously, all of Connie, Steven, and eventually Stevonnie's writing, voice direction, and expressions are all over-exaggerated alongside the details of the plot. And while I can see how some of the plot details, like the pair suddenly knowing how to drive an old car, or Connie finding it morally wrong to drive as a kid but not race on public roads as an unlicensed fake adult, and see everything else as just some fun flair on top of this episode about some pretty unfun topics. Anyway, back to the episode. Kevin's arrival gives us our first peek into the dichotomy that colors the rest of this one, being how Steven and Connie express their feelings toward what happened at the end of Alone Together. In between some more great Kevin lines and Greg being a good father, Steven displays his more active rage towards Kevin and towards what he did to Stevonnie, while Connie is, quote, thinking mad, more quietly stewing about what happened. And even though both of them express their discomfort and their anger differently, both of them want the same thing, for Kevin to pay for what he did. And even though Connie does want that payment to just be him thinking about his actions or whatever, both of the kids have the same idea, as they form back into Stevonnie and prepare for a good old-fashioned race. Besides Lars and Sadie, we pretty much have the entire collection of the older kids of Beach City at this race, and I think they're all used pretty well here. Ronaldo especially is a treat, as since Kevin's appearance allows him to not be the most annoying character here, it's very easy to appreciate his litany of great lines about the Supremo. Eventually, Stevonnie shows up to spoil the Kevin Fest, and it's immediately clear that Stevonnie has become much more accustomed to the whole fusion thing, as the character is more clearly a combination of Connie and Steven's personality, rather than just being two preteens controlling a meat mecha. In comparison to their debut, there are just significantly less lines that are clearly coming from one side or the other, as we really only get that effect from Alone Together in the moments before they break up in this episode. Speaking of the fusion, everybody here seems to have a general understanding that Stevonnie is Connie and Steven combined together in some way, and yet everybody still treats them as if they were a single entity. This kind of vague representation of this episode's events is something that kind of permeates throughout this entire thing, as despite it being very clear that Kevin is actively trying to keep each one of his races close, nobody ever says anything that indicates this, which again, I understand if some people find this off-putting, but in a show that already kind of exists in a space where nobody questions anything ever, including its titular character, it doesn't really bother me that much. Anyway, back to Stevonnie. Her characterization is really fun, especially throughout the first half of this episode, with the character's ridiculous growls and huge expressions setting the stakes for their race so stinking well. Speaking of the race, it's what takes up the second half of this episode, and even before the scene in the middle of it that steals the show here, it has a ton of things to like about it. From the purple aesthetic from Alone Together being back in full force, to the great over-the-top and often illogical drifting, to the fun stylized visuals, to Kevin mocking Stevonnie and getting them more and more frustrated, everything during the segment is just done really well. In the middle of this race, we get a quick moment that ultimately ends up being Kevin's most defining moment in the entire franchise, as after giving Stevonnie an entire story about why he's such a jerk, telling the Fusion about some sick little brother of his, he eventually admits that he fabricated the entire thing, and that the real reason that Kevin is the way he is just because he finds this kind of behavior funny. In a show that aims to ultimately make you see the other side of almost all of its antagonists, it's such an interesting moment to see them admit that some people are just jerks because they feel like it. Kevin's fake story is what takes us to the scene this episode has been building up to the entire time, as Stevonnie's rage continues to grow to the point of tunnel visioning on exclusively Kevin, a state that's well animated to literally transform the road into a tunnel where the only thing in focus is the antagonist's vehicle. Just like its equivalent emotional breakdown scene in Alone Together, this one has some killer imagery too, such as the road falling apart, marking the Fusion's inability to escape this predicament, as their anger towards Kevin for what he did and who he is clouds their vision from them being able to see anything else. Eventually, they become so overwhelmed by what they've turned Kevin into as the sole face of their trauma that the visual representation of such causes them to lose control, both of the Fusion and of the vehicle. The next time we get to see the situation, we're watching a conversation between Connie and Steven, and while there is admittedly a little bit of the very on-the-nose writing that Steven Universe was known for,
So why should he get to have any say over how we feel?
this scene still delivers in showing us the character's realization that they've completely let Kevin win, and that everything that they've been doing, including the sacred act of fusing, was done because of him. In this conversation, Connie is the one who ultimately ends up taking the lead, and I really like how they kind of make her the main character of this episode, as well sure, Steven does get to growl at Kevin and dramatically gasp, it's Connie who ultimately comes to the conclusion that they should be racing for Stevonnie and not for Kevin. After they come back together and Kevin lets them catch up, the pair begin to completely ignore his antagonization, as they are instead able to properly enjoy the beautiful view from atop the mountain, a view they had missed before because they were turned around, both literally at Kevin and figuratively at the trauma of their past. When Kevin eventually goes for the photo finish he was always going to get, Stevonnie remains, at least to an outside observer, to be completely unbothered by his demeanor, something that ultimately completely breaks Kevin. And unlike most episodes of his titular show, this one gives somebody else besides Steven the final line, as the last few minutes focus on Kevin, and how ultimately his jerk facade is destroyed by somebody standing up to him and not feeding into it.
Obsessed!
Even more so than Alone Together was an episode about somebody going through a traumatic experience at the hands of somebody who didn't see them as a human worth respecting, Beach City Drift is an episode about getting over that experience. And even if the rest of this one is this really fun stylized racing romp with some of the funniest lines in the series,
are you saying you don't know the true power of the Supremo?
it truly does deliver on giving this really terrific look into how to get past the innate drive to get back at somebody who's wronged you, and how to not let that urge take over your life. While the beautiful backgrounds of this episode are present to the audience throughout the entire race, for Stevonnie, until their near-death experience, they're just backgrounds, as the character is ultimately unable to see anything besides Kevin. Even before their tunnel vision is highlighted visually, the character is so focused on the impossible goal of trying to get Kevin to realize what he did was wrong that they miss the beauty all around them. As I mentioned before, this episode ends up being more focused on Connie rather than Steven being the one who realizes this. And even though she's not physically present for a good chunk of it, I still find this to be one of the best Connie episodes in the franchise. In comparison to Steven's ever-present, highly energetic responses to everything, Connie is more subdued in how she feels about what the pair experienced, seeing it as more unfair than anything else that Steven and her were so negatively affected by Kevin's actions, and he doesn't even care. And that's what drives her throughout this episode. As juxtaposed to Steven's somewhat blind rage, she is driven by justice, as she tries to make it even for the Connie of the past. But when the pair nearly dies trying to do so, Connie realizes that everything they've done that night never really had the chance to make Kevin realize the error of his ways. The only thing it really had a chance to do was get them both hurt. Hurt physically and hurt by Kevin once again. Had the pair finished the race without the realization in the middle, and even if Kevin had somehow let them win, he still would not have seen the error of his ways, and Steven and Connie would just go back to their regular lives, waiting for another chance to get even. But because of the near-death experience at the top of the mountain, Connie is able to finally see just how much control over their lives they've given Kevin, and is finally able to cut it off. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want a more direct way to call me names in the comment section, you can find my Twitter somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in about a week for a video that has unfortunately less Kevin. Thanks for watching.